All right, concept 4. Give examples of the progressive movement in action by comparing and contrasting Theodore Roosevelt's Square Deal with that of Woodrow Wilson's New Freedom. So, first looking at Theodore Roosevelt's Square Deal. On September 6, 1901, 6 months after his second inauguration, President McKinley was shot by an anarchist, and Theodore Roosevelt became President of the United States. The Square Deal, let's bring that up. As President, Roosevelt believed he had two important functions. The first was to serve as the moral leader of the American people, and second was to enforce the national interest against special interest. Roosevelt thought that the country faced two great dangers: the mob, which would be whipped up by demagogues to overthrow existing institutions, and the plutocracy, which lacked the necessary virtues for leadership and by its excessive greed incited the mob. So you had these two countervailing forces disrupting the basic functions of society, the people and moneyed interest, right? Both antagonistic to each other. This is another way of describing this is class warfare. Roosevelt's role as the moral leader of the people was to give balance out of the difference of these two interests and give everyone a, wait for it, square deal. He believed in change, but gradual change within established institutions. Roosevelt's interest in reform was always qualified by his distaste for most progressives. His own program was based upon his moral principles and was general rather than anything really specific. Roosevelt advocated trust busting, but his moral sense led him to distinguish between good trusts and bad trusts. Actually, the trusts were more powerfully entrenched when he left than when he entered office. Quote from him, "Our aim is not to do away with corporations. On the contrary, these big aggregations are an inevitable development of modern industrialism. We are not hostile to them. We are merely determined that they shall be so handled as to subserve the public good." Unquote. It is impossible to keep in mind Roosevelt. It's important to keep in mind Roosevelt came to power at a time when the country was ready for action. His philosophy was to regulate all aspects of society and to provide stability serving the national interest. The regulation was based on Roosevelt's moral principles, and to assure each individual unfettered opportunity for realizing the dignity and satisfaction that came with honest work, a square deal. So consequently, Roosevelt's conception of the presidency was different from that of his recent past predecessors, who had been willing to follow the leadership of Congress. The presidents from 1870 through the 1890s had been content to let well enough alone in business and politics. But Roosevelt was discontented with the existing practices in both politics and business, and demanded reform with the use of executive leadership. Examples of Theodore Roosevelt's square deals and philosophy in action. So, one example we could look at is the Northern Security case of 1902. In 1902, Roosevelt shocked Wall Street when he initiated a suit against a giant railroad combination, the Northern Securities Company, which led to its dissolution in 1904, meaning it would be broken up into smaller companies. The Northern Securities Companies was created in 1901 when James J. Hill and J.P. Morgan, who owned the great Northern and Northern Pacific railroads, were competing with E.H. Harriman, who was associated with Rockefeller's interests and owned the Union Pacific and Southern Pacific railroads, for control of the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy railroads. The Chicago Burlington had control of the best connections from Chicago to the West and throughout the West. When Hill gained control of the Chicago Burlington Railroad, Harriman launched a counterattack by seeking control of Hill's Northern Pacific stock on the New York Stock Exchange. The rivals forced the value of the stock up to $1,000 a share, ruining many speculators and threatening to cause a major panic. Since neither side could win a clear-cut victory, they decided to put their stock into a holding company owned by the two groups, the Northern Security Companies. The significance was that a virtual monopoly of Western transportation facilities was created. Right, so this basically from Chicago all the way out through California and from Arizona all the way up through Washington, that whole western portion of the United States, one corporation controlled all of it. As mentioned earlier, the Supreme Court ordered the dissolution of the Northern Security Companies in 1904. Although actual ownership of the railroad was not affected, this decision had extremely important results and consequences. It made further prosecution possible. Roosevelt soon ordered suits against the meatpackers, Standard Oil Trust, and the American Tobacco Company. It also served notice on that all great corporations that they could no longer ignore the Anti-Sherman Act from 1890. So that was passed some 14 years earlier, but nobody had enforced it until Roosevelt. Roosevelt also instituted suits against 44 corporations and won a reputation as a trust buster. It must be remembered, though, Roosevelt was not opposed to big business per se, but believed in federal action only in cases of serious misbehavior. Roosevelt considered the extension of government regulation over railroads his most important program. Quote, "The question of transportation lies at the root of all industrial success, and the revolution in transportation which has taken place during the last half-century has been the most important factor in the growth of the new industrial conditions. At present, railway is the highway of commerce, and we must do our best to see that it is kept open to all on equal terms. It is far better that it should be managed by private individuals than by government, but it can only be so managed on condition that justice is done to the public," unquote. As mentioned earlier, the Interstate Commerce Act of 1887 was abandoned by Congress and emasculated by the court decisions to the point where by 1900 it was useless. So concentration of control by a few major railroads continued to grow until by 1903, 6 major railroad systems representing a combination of almost 800 independent railroads and a capitalization of over $9 billion controlled 3/4 of the mileage in the country. After the Spanish-American War, freight charges had increased sharply without any corresponding increase in wages or improvement in services, while rebates, discrimination, and favoritism forbidden by the 1887 Act continued unabated. So the result, in February of 1903, Roosevelt signed the Elkins Act into law. The Elkins Act redefined and outlawed rebates and provided for punishment of those receiving as well as giving rebates. However, the Elkins Act was continually violated, as the offenders could usually obscure the violations by bookkeeping methods over which the Interstate Commerce Commission had no control. So in 1904, Roosevelt pronounced railroad regulation the, quote, paramount issue, unquote. Roosevelt asked Congress to confer on the Interstate Commerce Commission the power to regulate the railroads. After an investigation, Congress responded with the Hepburn Act of 1906. The Hepburn Act made federal regulation possible for the first time. The act extended federal regulation to include storage, refrigeration, and terminal facilities. The railroads could appeal, but the burden of proof was now on the railroads and not on the commission. The Hepburn Act represented a substantial advance in railway regulation. Within 2 years, the Interstate Commerce Commission had heard almost twice as many complaints as in its previous 19 years. By 1911, the commission had reduced over 200,000 rates, some by as much as 50%. Federal regulation was further extended in 1910 under the Mann-Elkins Act to include telephone and telegraph companies. So in the Anthracite strike of May 1902 to March 1903, the strike started when the United Mine Workers under President John Mitchell struck on May 12, 1902 for higher wages, union recognition, and an 8-hour workday. Right? This is before we had this law. Right? You could work up to 12, 16 hours a day, and there wasn't much you could do about it but quit. The mine operators were dead set against concessions. When the miners went out, the operators shut down their properties and prepared to starve the strikers into submission. Throughout the summer and early fall, the miners held firm. They conducted themselves well, avoiding violence and expressing full willingness to submit their claims to arbitration. As the price of anthrax soared with the approach of winter, sentiment in their behalf mounted rapidly. Roosevelt shared the public sympathy for the miners, and the threat of a coal famine naturally alarmed him. In October of 1902, Roosevelt called a conference of operators and miners and appointed a commission to mediate their differences, and as a result of which Mitchell called off the strike on October 21st, 1902. In March 1903, the commission awarded the union a 10% wage increase, a 9-hour workday, and no union recognition. Since Roosevelt had not intervened on the side of the owners, he established himself with a reputation as pro-labor, but he was always suspicious of labor's radicalism. The strike indicated Roosevelt's square deal philosophy, as stated by himself. Everyone would receive a square deal. So those are just some examples of Roosevelt's square deal. In the next clip, we will look at Wilson's New Freedom. So I'll see you guys all there.